Good evening, everyone. Thank you so very much for joining us here tonight. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that McNally-Robinson is located here on Treaty 1 territory. That's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, of course, McNally-Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Brewstertown. We're so pleased you could join us here both in person and virtually for the Winnipeg launch of Indictment, the Criminal Justice System on Trial by Benjamin Perrin. Now, this is a very important book. It's a groundbreaking new book by a nationally best-selling author. It's already at the heart of a vital national conversation about our failed criminal justice system and how we can build a new way to better address harm in our society. It brings together the heartrending stories of survivors and incarcerated people with the latest research, and is already being hailed as revolutionary. It was named as one of the most anticipated books of fall 2023. Now, I could speak extemporaneously, but a wise person once told me that if Jody Wilson-Raybould has something to say, we should probably defer to her. And she has called this book a clear, compassionate, and practical vision for a much-needed transformation of the criminal justice system. Now, just to let you know how this evening will go, we'll be hearing from two representatives of the group Mom Stop the Harm in just a moment, and immediately following that, there'll be a presentation from the author, Benjamin Perrin. Following that, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions. Now, if you're located here, please feel free to just put up your hand and I'll run over to you with this microphone. It's not a comment on your ability to project your voice. It just ensures that those watching at home can hear the question and prevents us from having to repeat it. If you are one of those people tuning in virtually, please feel free to write any questions you might have in the chat and we'll put them to the author as time permits. I will have some completely thrilling notes about signing procedure for you at the end of the night, so please stand by. But for right now, I'd like to welcome two representatives of Mom Stop the Harm. First, you'll be hearing from Arlene Kolb, and then Antoinette, Gravel-Ouellette. So, Arlene.
Hello, everyone. My name is Arlene Kolb. I am a member of Mom Stop the Harm, and I am co-founder of Overdose Awareness Manitoba. Okay, let's start with the hard part. July 18, 2014, our son Jesse went out and never came home. He died from a fentanyl poisoning. I've been advocating ever since then. I knew that if our son died from fentanyl, that there would be many, many, many more. I know that since 2014, 2,600 people have died from overdose. So I have been working very, very hard advocating for the last 9 years with the past government. It's been a difficult journey with our past government. It was hard to get them to listen, to understand that we had to go a different way, that we couldn't just say no, and that we couldn't treatment our way out of this. I think that what I've learned is that substance use, addiction, and justice go hand in hand. I've spoken to many families over the years and I've heard a lot of terrible stories. And one thing that I've learned is that we shouldn't have to have our children arrested to get help. And that was what it was coming down to for many families. And that we knew that this was not the way to go. I've spoken to many, many people over the years. I've spoken with our police chief. I've spoken to our mayors, councillors, our past government, our present government. And we know that we have to do things differently. And when Jesse passed away, I was advocating for treatment. I was advocating for help. But I soon realized that the drugs were killing us, that the toxic supply was killing and taking our loved ones. Somebody dies in Manitoba every single day from an overdose. We know that naloxone, the life-saving antidote to an overdose. We know that over 3,000 kits are given out every single month. Every single month. We know that, that we have an average of 44 people dying every month, that the numbers just increase, that we cannot just do the same old thing, and that we shouldn't have to rely on our children to be arrested to get help. That's not the answer. So it's been a difficult journey trying to get this information out to the public, to let people know that this was happening every single day and that there was really nothing being done about it. There was a story of a young man I read a number of years ago. He was going to be leaving jail. CBC was doing stories on him to talk to him about what the transition would be like for him when he left jail. This man left jail and he was able to survive, to do this on his own for quite a long time, until he couldn't anymore. And what I believe is that I believe in treatment, but I don't believe that should be the only call that a person has. What if they want to use? What if they need to use something? Is their only option to go to the street, where our drugs are so toxic that, for me, this is a crisis, and we weren't treating it that way. This man has gone back to jail, and he has put himself into a federal prison in the hopes that he will get better help when he leaves. That is not our answer. That is not who we are here in Manitoba. So I could talk a lot about the past and about all the mistakes that have been made and all the people that have died. But we are on the cusp of change. We have an opportunity now with a new government to do things differently. My hope is that we move forward with addiction medicine, that it is not focused entirely on treatment, that people will be offered help when they ask for help, it will be available, and that they will be treated with dignity. We are past the time of just saying no. We are in a different place now. The drugs are not what they were 12 years ago. You don't always get to live till tomorrow. So we have to address that. And I know that with a change of government and with the people that we have now, and as the mayor and our police chief, I have spoken to all of these people, and what was lacking before was the desire to all work together. So in the first time in many years, I have hope that we could do things different here in Manitoba, that we could lead the way on this. So I'm happy to be here to help Ben to share this story, because justice and addiction go hand in hand, and we have to take care of it all together, and that our children shouldn't have to go to jail to get help, and that we have to do something about the supply, because you can't get help if you're dead. Okay, thank you very much.
Beautifully said, Arlene. My name is Antoinette Gravel-Ouellette, and I'm very pleased to be here tonight. I first connected with Ben, actually, when one of my kids was taking a course, and said to me, "Mom, have you ever heard of this guy?" And I said, "No." And then I started to do some checking and on the work that Ben was doing. And the person that had shared it with me was one of my kids. And I'll tell a little bit of story that's both their story and my story, and I do this with their permission. About 6.5 years ago, when they were looking for help for treatment, to change really their life, and there was nowhere to go through withdrawal. I'm not from Winnipeg, I'm from the Brandon area. And when they wanted the help, because at that time they needed to go to, in order to go to treatment, they were told they had to go through withdrawal first. And then there was nowhere to do that. And I said, that's ridiculous. So they ended up going through detox on my couch. And I use a little bit of colorful language, but not too much. And when they were very ill because they were coming off of opioids, and I was helping them as moms do, holding her hair back, she was throwing up, going through. She said, "Why are you being nice to me?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I'm nothing but an effing addict. That's all I'll ever be, and I'll never be anything else, and I'll probably go back to using." And I said, "Oh, honey, that's not who you are. That's what you're going through right now, but that's not who you are." And I realized part of what was going on for them and for many others is the stigma that's attached to people that use substances, and the self-stigma that was taking place, and how that is all interwoven. I'm very proud today to say that they're doing work with CanMeds. They're doing videos for addiction doctors that when they're taking their courses to educate and to bring that other message forward. And they are just registered for the University for Political Science. So there's always hope. There's always hope for people and for the struggles that they go through. And it's not who they are. And stigma, I think, is the biggest factor. One of the things that they wrote was, when I was looking for help, I was expected to do exactly what I was going for the help for. You wanted me to stay abstinent from a substance for 7 days to go to treatment. That's systemic stigma, and it makes no sense. So I just wanted to give a little bit of a backstory of how I got introduced to Ben, which I'm a big fan of his work and how he's opened my heart and my eyes as well. Having so many things woven through both this book and the previous book that he's written. So if you don't know about that one, I'm going to put a plug in here, check that one out too. So I'm the program manager, program coordinator for Moms Stop the Harm. And we do programs across Canada. So kind of my job or my contract with them is finding facilitators and supporting facilitators in communities across Canada to do 2 programs that we offer. One is Healing Hearts, which are for people that have lost a loved one due to substance-related harms. And the other one is Holding Hope, supporting families from a compassionate, evidence-based lens and perspective as families are supporting loved ones. Because I find often that's not spoken about enough, is the aftermath of afterwards. And as people are navigating anticipatory grief, which is something that I have also some experience with. So we have those programs right now, I think across Canada. I think we have 42 across Canada for each of those groups. And I think it takes us all working together to do this. Ben definitely brings his expertise. We have compassionate, heartfelt facilitators that across Canada, they're wanting to give back. We work with all kinds of harm reduction agencies and groups and nurses, and it takes everybody to do their part. I so agree with Arlene. We were all like, yes, when we got this new government in that's going to listen and make changes. And as Arlene said, dead people don't recover. So how do we, instead of having people incarcerated in order to get help, and to get the help that they need? How do we work on every spectrum, every lens, before, after, during? And who am I to say that like abstinence only is not the only way? Lots of people use substances all the time. I myself have been abstinent from alcohol for 23 years. I used to be way skinnier, so guess what? I shifted. And so now what I'm working on is a different piece. It's about wholeness and wellness. And how do we help people be whole and be the best that they can be according to what they want in their lives, not according to somebody else putting a standard. One size does not fit all for people, and we need to meet people where they're at. And that's the last part I'm gonna leave with, so welcome, Ben.
Thank you so very much, Antoinette and Arlene. Thank you for sharing. Won't Stop the Harm, you can find it on social media, on almost every social media platform, and at won'tstoptheharm.com as well. So please do check them out. It is now my pleasure to introduce Benjamin Perrin, the author of tonight's book, Indictment, the Criminal Justice System on Trial. We're very grateful to the University of Toronto Press for publishing this book and helping to make this evening happen. Benjamin Perrin is a professor at the Peter A. Ballard School of Law at the University of British Columbia. He has served in the Prime Minister's office as in-house legal counsel and lead policy advisor on criminal justice and public safety. He was also a law clerk at the Supreme Court of Canada. He is the author of Overdose, Heartbreak and Hope in Canada's Opioid Crisis, and of course, Indictment. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you so much for being here. It's absolutely a pleasure to be back in Winnipeg at McNally Robinson. We're supposed to be here 3 years ago in April of 2020 to launch the last book. Bad timing. So I'm thrilled to be here today. I want to thank you so much, Arlene and Antoinette, for sharing. We just had dinner together, a group of us from Stop the Harm down the road, and both of them, I don't know quite sure what I'm going to say, and you just blew it out of the water. So I really thank you for coming from all the way from Brandon as well tonight to be with us. Thank you to John. So I'm going to share with you about this new book, Indictment, and the starting point for me is how this book began. I received a letter in the mail, and it was completely out of the blue. This happens sometimes. You know, many folks can't afford a lawyer, and when they get really, really desperate, they will even take the step of contacting a law professor. That's how desperate they are. So this was a 7 to 8 page handwritten letter, and it would have been easy if it was like some of the other emails or letters I get, someone asking for legal advice or support. I'm not practicing law right now. I'm a full-time professor, so I just say thank you for contacting me. Refer them to maybe legal aid or some community-based organization. Those are easy to deal with. This was hard. And the reason it was hard is because this man did not ask me for anything. He just wanted to share his story. And I read his letter, and this one line completely stood out. It like hit me over the head with like a 2x4. He said, if you want to turn a man into an animal, put him in a cage without the resources to build himself back up. This is from an Indigenous man who was being confined in Fraser Regional Correctional Center, just an hour and a half from my office. And I kept coming back in the office, and the letter be sitting there. I didn't know what to do with it. Around the same time, Jody Wilson-Raybould, who you heard a minute ago, very thrilled, read the book and had some wonderfully kind things to say. Around the same time, though, this is 5 years ago when I got that letter, she was heading the Department of Justice. And they had a huge public consultation. And one of the questions they asked was, if you could design a new criminal justice system from scratch, what would it look like? So I have this letter and I had this question, and that was the spark for this project. So we set out to talk to people, to listen to people whose lives had been devastatingly impacted by the criminal justice system. People who were survivors, victims of crime, people who had been incarcerated, This sort of stuff we heard ranged from the lowest level offense with someone who keyed a car, all the way up to people who had committed drug trafficking, uttering threats, assaults, sexual violence, and even had served life sentences for murder. So it ran the gamut. We also interviewed family members of people who had been devastatingly impacted by the system. I got to know Mom Stop the Harm through my research for my last book. And I knew how important it was to talk to folks who had that experience that you cannot get reading court cases. I also talked to people who worked in the system. We interviewed corrections officers. We wanted to hear from them. What's life really like behind bars from their perspective? We talked to police officers and police chiefs. We talked to elders. We talked to community-based organizations that support all kinds of folks in the system, people with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder going through the justice system, people who had serious mental health issues, people who had childhood trauma going through the system, people who had all kinds of experiences with poverty, displacement. And in this, what became clear to me as we heard more and more from these folks was that the system isn't broken. You often hear that the criminal justice system is broken. It's not broken. It's perfectly designed to get the results that it's getting. It is not a few bad apples when we hear the death of someone in custody. It's not the case of people just making bad decisions that lead them into jail, and you see skyrocketing rates of violent crime, of victims not reporting crime. That the problem is with the system itself. I want to give you a glimpse into some of the stories that we heard tonight. Each chapter in Indictment starts with the real story of someone who we interviewed. And then we bring in some of the professionals, the research and statistics. But the reason we do it, we lead with stories, is the same that Antoinette mentioned a minute ago. I don't know about you, but I haven't seen anyone's mind get changed by just giving them more statistics. There have been over 36,000 people in Canada who've died since 2016 from unregulated drugs. 36,000. If I told you there was 50,000 or 100,000, do you think it would make any change tomorrow morning to the response? Absolutely not. It doesn't. It's just numbers at this point. And the same thing goes true of things like life-saving interventions. So providing people with a safe place to use these toxic drugs, whether it's a supervised consumption site or an overdose prevention site. We've had hundreds of peer-reviewed studies for over 20 years saying that those save lives. If we have another 100, is 500 studies enough? It's not going to change anyone's mind who is dead set against them. So it's not about just the facts. It's that I realized for me that what needed that change wasn't just a change of mind, it was a change of my heart. So you heard a minute ago in the introduction, I was referred to as the former Chief Criminal Justice Advisor to the Prime Minister. Didn't mention who, some of you know who that was. That's why you're laughing, people are laughing like, oh, Trudeau, Chrétien, it's not that. It was Stephen Harper. Now people are like, I'm leaving, I'm out the door. So someone just came in now, oh, that's good, okay. He's just counting numbers, okay, yeah. And I was at the front of the Tough on Crime parade. And now I'm, written a book calling not only for the decriminalization of drugs, which my last book did, but this book says we should abolish traditional prisons and jails. And rather than having more police to address these issues in our communities, we need non-police responses. Okay, so it's a completely, now how did that happen? I can tell you it was not from reading another study. I eventually did read those studies and they were compelling. But what had to change first was I had to have a softer heart. Hard hearts and closed minds are what is the reason that we don't see changes in our community. Hard hearts and closed minds. And one of the main ways that my heart began to soften and change was as I was doing these interviews, as I was hearing from people about their lived experience, I was finding that things were not adding up for me. I thought of myself as a good person. Part of my story, it's not talked about hardly at all in the book, but I do like to mention it because people are like, what could lead to that change? Some people said, this is like a road to Damascus moment. You're like, Paul, I'm like, you're not far off. I was going through a real rediscovery of my faith. So for me, what that looked like is I'd be reading the Bible in the morning and I would read about, Jesus is like healing the lepers and he's saying like you were in prison and I was in prison and you visited me. That's a line from the Bible, okay? And I was like, oh man, I don't think this lines up very well with the way I view people who are in prison. And it led to this kind of moment where as I was hearing people share their stories, I was like, holy smokes, my heart isn't right here. So a softening of your heart could come in a number of different ways. It could come through your faith, whatever that faith tradition is. It can come through having a family member or a friend who you've supported or journeyed with. The research shows that someone who has had a family member who has had a substance use disorder or has died from unregulated drugs is far more likely to support evidence-based solutions to it. So maybe it's your proximity to someone like that. Maybe it's the human rights imperative that we have. Maybe it's your sense that there's just this profound injustice. Maybe it's driven by a sense that we need to have real reconciliation in our society. Okay? Maybe you're persuaded by the research, by the evidence. Whatever the reason is, we've got to have those conversations and soften our hearts before we can get our heads straight as a society. So the stories are a big way to do that. The first person who responded to our research poster, it asked just one question. It said, what was your experience like with the justice system? And the first person to reply, we give a pseudonym to everyone to protect their privacy. Her name was Courtney. And when I talked to her, she was 39 years old. She first started getting locked up at age 12. That's the youngest you can be in prison in Canada. From ages 12 to 39, she was locked up in prison, in and out, in and out. It wasn't 25 years straight. 1 month here, 6 months there, for 25 years of her life. She had never even counted it all up until I asked her how long, and she couldn't believe it. When I asked Courtney what was her experience like starting with her time in the juvenile justice system, like many of the folks that I interviewed, I was surprised to hear her talk about how positive it was. This isn't lining up with what I've heard from other studies. I didn't expect this, and then I realized why. Comparing what her life was like before incarceration and the abuse she suffered, life in prison was pretty good. I asked her what was pretty good about it. She said her answer, she said, they fed us really well. We got 3 meals a day, and sometimes we even got a snack. That was what was pretty good about her time as a child being locked behind bars. Then we talked about, well, what else happened behind bars? And then the real story started to flow out. She was in a co-ed institution, some of which still exists today. So she's in there with teenage men as a 12-year-old Indigenous girl. She said that when she would misbehave, which I said, well, what does that look like? What's misbehaving look like? Well, when I would swear at the guards, they would lock me up in the rubber room. They were only allowed to go outside when they were playing sports. And the boys would sexually harass her repeatedly. Of the folks I spoke to, some of them had served maximum security penitentiary sentences in some of the harshest prisons in Canada. And they described the time in the juvenile justice system as the most terrifying and traumatizing because they were children. Absolutely appalling. I have kids who are 8, 10, and 12. I can't even imagine what life would be like for them if that happened to them. The people we spoke to who have been incarcerated throughout most of their lives, like Courtney, began using substances to cope with the pain. And that's what we know. We know that. Early childhood trauma is as connected, Gabriel Mate says, to adult substance use and mental illness. There's as much evidence for that as there is that smoking tobacco causes lung cancer. You can draw a straight line. The youngest age of the people we interviewed in our study who started using substances and got addicted to them was 5 years old. Addicted to alcohol at 5 years old. These aren't outliers. This is the typical numbers of people starting to use things like heroin, fentanyl, cocaine, methamphetamines, MDMA, serious stuff, right? 11, 12, 13. Joining a street gang, age 9, to protection. We heard about how children who would end up then in the system because they were often caught up on these drug charges or things related to joining these street gangs, they would be released on conditions that they stay at this fixed address. Well, that doesn't work very well when you're in an abusive foster home. So one of the people that we spoke to, this young Indigenous man, said, my choice was either to abide by the condition that I reside at this address and be beaten with certainty that's going to happen to me, or I breach my conditions and I end up going back into the juvie jail. So it's the immediate abuse tonight, or it's the trauma and the abuse tomorrow, right? The cruelty and injustice within the system is absolutely staggering, and not enough of us know about it. Look, prisons are not just meant to keep people inside, they're keeping the rest of us out. Okay. I am a criminal law professor, I'm a lawyer, I cannot go up to a prison and ask to go in and have a look inside. Canada is one of the only Western developed countries that has not signed on to an international treaty that gives national and international monitors the rights to independently come in whenever they want and look around our places of custody. That is appalling. We heard that when people who are incarcerated do complain, they often face reprisals from corrections officers, and then it'll be told on the range that they're the one who complained that day, and they'll get the shit beaten out of them by the fellow inmates. Okay, so this for me, what has really been driving me, and why we're out speaking about this, and why I've written the book, and why we have a podcast where you can hear, it's a free podcast, you can hear the stories of the folks we interviewed. Many of them agreed to let their own voices speak for themselves, is so that people can hear what is being done in our names, in the name of justice, and with our tax dollars to people in our communities. Now, the incredible thing, of course, is that none of this is making any of us safer. None of this is making any of us safer. And so we're really left with a choice right now in Canada between one or two things. One option is that we're going to deal with things like rising crime rates, rising rates of homelessness, higher unregulated drug deaths. We're going to deal with that through tough on crime measures, the same measures that I used to support. What does that mean? That means more police, more punishment, more prison. Okay, that's tough on crime. We're going to punish our way out of these problems. The other thing that's on offer is we're going to tinker with the system. We're going to put we'll do one supervised consumption site here. We'll hire some more, Indigenous judges. Maybe we'll have a mental health court. We're going to tweak the system a bit, tinker with the system. Those things have been tried. They don't move the needle. They do not have the impact that anyone would think. And so what I do in this book, part one is, this is for the photo here. Is that good? Something good done? Okay, good. It was well timed, John. I'm sure. All the proceeds are donated to 2 organizations in the book, by the way. So that's why I have no shame in flogging the book. Buy the book. It's going to help people right away. And one of them supports people exiting street gangs. Straight up in Saskatchewan. We're going to tomorrow, and another is a restorative justice program. So in part one of the book, the people we interviewed are the witnesses as we put the criminal justice system on trial. They're the witnesses. You're turning the tables around on the system. Okay. Part two of the book, you're like, this is a heavy night, man. This is like my night off. Some law students are here to start reading week. Way to lay it on heavy, Ben. Well, the good news is what I'm going to finish by talking about is there's a better way. And so part two is how could we do things differently? That's the conversation we want to have go forward. And I do think that there's a historic opportunity to do things differently for better results. And so that's what I describe in the book as a new transformative justice vision. I think that that's the goal. It should be to transform the trauma in our society rather than continue to keep transmitting it. Right now, our goal is to punish people and try to make us feel safe with more handcuffs and locking people up, and it's not working. So transformative justice at its basic means when someone is harmed, when they're a victim of crime, they're a survivor, we need to come around as a community and support them and provide them with help. Not threaten them with jail if they don't show up to testify at trial. Not treat them like a piece of evidence. All those sorts of things that survivors who we interviewed said was worse than the victimization they experienced, the secondary harm of people in the system harming them. The other side is we need to actually heal the harm and trauma that folks who are causing harm are perpetrating in society. It turns out that pretty much everyone who ends up in the criminal justice system themselves are victims of crime. One study in Alberta found that between 95 and 98% of Indigenous people in Alberta's jails had experienced significant levels of adverse childhood experiences, childhood trauma, not to mention the intergenerational trauma as well. So I don't have time to get into it all in detail, but I want to give just a glimpse of a couple of the ideas that we were putting forward in this book. Like, what would a new transformative justice approach look like? We answer that question. If we could design a new system from scratch, like what would it look like? And let's start moving rapidly in that direction. So there's 7 key components. Each of them is not just a neat idea. There are policies and programs right now that are working and have been working in many cases for decades, whether it's here in Canada, whether it's in an Indigenous community or overseas. So we've got research to back it up. As Antoinette said a few minutes ago, we're looking for ideas that are compassionate, that enter into these very painful situations with some understanding and evidence-based, what's going to work. So let's start with an example. Preventing early childhood trauma. Someone who experiences those sort of physical, sexual, emotional abuse as a child, they're 50% more likely to harm someone later in life. 50% more likely. But they're also more likely to also be victimized. They're 8 times more likely to be sexually victimized as an adult. So if we can support young families and protect kids today, you're going to immediately prevent harm from happening, and you're going to help down the road. So they've done randomized controlled trials, studies where they look at families. Some were supported by having public health nurses come into their home in the 2nd trimester. You talk about early intervention, doesn't get much more earlier than that. And from 2nd trimester to age 2, they go in and support the family, in-home visits, connecting them with resources. And the program ends at age 2. Something incredible happens. They follow those kids up. By the time they're 15, what they found was that those children had 78% lower instances of themselves being abused as kids. We have saved them from being harmed, protecting kids from abuse. And they had 81% less criminal convictions as teenagers. 81% less. This program, people, it must cost a lot of money sending nurses into the home. Public health, we don't have a lot of that. You could run this with peers or elders or social workers and community members who are trained up. The program makes money. It doesn't just pay for itself. A study by the Rand Institute found that for each family that they participated in the program, it generated a net savings of $18,000 US in foregone child welfare, criminal justice, healthcare expenses, okay? So I do talks to all audiences. I talked to churches about the stuff I mentioned about my faith. I talked to the Fraser Institute a few weeks ago. Are we getting good value for our public safety money? We're not. They're like, oh, this is kind of interesting stuff. We can save money and be good. I'm like, yeah, like, let's do that. Let's all get on board. The next example of what would a new approach look like is what I describe as sort of public health approaches. And more broadly, it's if we have an issue with homelessness and displacement, let's provide people homes. If we have a problem with people in mental health distress, let's provide mental health crisis support. If we have a problem with people dying of unregulated drugs, let's bring in evidence-based programs like a regulated safer supply, like safe places to use. We're not doing that right now. We are treating all of these problems like they're law and order criminal justice problems. And it actually makes those problems worse, and it makes us all spend a lot more money, and it has a devastating impact, of course, on the folks who are subjected to them. So in Vancouver, I'll just give you one example of how horrific this looks. Our new mayor got elected, and people went for those 2 options, tinker or tough on crime. Tough on crime. He promised 100 new police and 100 new mental health nurses. Guess how many the police got hired within 1 year? Just take a guess.
200.
Yeah, good. Oh, that's not that bad. 100. They're trying to hire more now. They say, oh, attrition. They hired all 100. How many of the 100 mental health nurses? 9.5. Just half a person is, yeah. 9.5. 9.5, that's it. Okay, it's a classic page. What they did put money into, and I saw it the other day, I was downtown Vancouver with a demonstration, and I saw it. They're going up and down Hastings Street, and there's 3 vehicles. The first is a garbage truck, the same garbage trucks that go by my house to take my garbage. The second was a dump truck, the same dump trucks we use at construction sites to take away old stuff to the dump. And the third was a police cruiser, and they are going up and down and they don't stop. They are keeping these are called the street sweeps. And the first time they did it, dozens and dozens of officers and bylaw officers, and they took people's tents, and they took people's cardboard boxes, and they took people's tarps, and they threw them in the garbage. That's what they did. We have students in our universities who have said, we don't have homes. Don't close the 24-hour study spaces. We have politicians in Canada right now, it was this morning or today, blaming safer supply for the homeless problem. That's what the federal Conservative leader said on his Twitter account less than 24 hours ago. He said that the federal government has flooded the streets with free drugs, and so now we have homelessness. So you go on his account and see it for yourself. One day he's saying it's veterans who are homeless, if you watch, and then the next day it's the druggies. He can't make his mind up, right? And it's sick and it's wrong. We had someone in a tent near our kids' school, just half a block from our house. In the winter, it was cold, but we went over and offered the hot meal. Okay, it's made. Hey, how are you doing? You okay? We're gonna leave some food. You know, thanks for the food. It goes along the next day. You know, we have a choice. It's not just government. It's easy to blame government. We have a choice whether we're going to engage the criminal justice system for non-criminal issues like that, or we're going to reach out and be a good neighbor. Okay? So the cost of imprisoning someone in Canada is like 4 times higher than for providing supported housing. Supported housing is way less expensive than shelter space. Those temporary shelters that aren't real homes, they cost a lot more than giving someone an actual home. Okay? Housing First is an evidence-based example where you say you don't have to stop using substances. First, we're going to put a roof over your head. We're not going to get you to go through like treatment and detox or stop drinking your alcohol or stop using drugs, and then we're going to give you a home. Let's give you a safe, warm place to stay. It turns out, guess what? People get stabilized and can have food and shelter and clothing. These are the most basic human things to have that dignity. It turns out that that's when things can start to turn around. You provide them with those other services. Okay. Number 3, there's a few more and then I'll wrap up. 24/7 non-police crisis response teams. Non-police. These are trained medics, social workers, peers. There are over 200 jurisdictions in North America that have at least piloted this model. So that when you call 911 or a non-emergency line, you don't just have 3 options of police, fire, or ambulance. The other option could be a crisis worker. In Eugene, Oregon, this is the program and profile in Indictment. There's a program called CAHOOTS, Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets, CAHOOTS. They've been operating for almost 30 years. It started as a non-governmental program, which I also point out because you can just do it. They just was like, enough. We're not going to wait to get people on board. Toronto has launched their program and expanded it. In the last month, they expanded it in some key neighborhoods. Ottawa's doing it. I want Vancouver and I want Winnipeg and every city in the country and the province to have these people available. And so one of the main reasons is that the police are not equipped to deal with people in mental health distress. They're not. They're not trained, they don't have the tools, and their very presence and their uniforms and their ability to use force escalates rather than de-escalates more often than not. And especially when you factor in the horrific experiences that Indigenous, Black, and people of color have had with the police, and the presence of police alone is not going to calm things down. In many cases, it amps things up. It turns out 68% of people who died in encounters with police were experiencing a mental health or substance use issue at the time. 68%. I also talk in the book about restorative justice. If folks have questions about that, we can talk more. The final 2 ones I want to just mention from what would a new approach look like is, look, there are going to be some people, despite our work to address the underlying causes, despite the non-police responses, despite the childhood trauma prevention, there will still be some people who are a significant risk to safety, you know, at least until they've got some treatment and support. That's just the reality. But they're going to eventually get out. And so in the book, I argue for getting rid of traditional prisons and jails. Instead, when we do have to separate people from society, it should be in a secure rehabilitation and healing place, where the goal is not to punish them, but to, again, transform the trauma and the harm. So is this just like a pie in the sky idea? Like I said, no. Norway is a country that had a very similar model to Canadian corrections, and they had a series of prison riots in the early 90s. Some guards were killed. So they had a national reckoning, and they said, we gotta do things different. They now have what's been described as the most humane and innovative system in the world. And it's all based around one question: what kind of a neighbor do you want to have? Because these folks are getting out. What kind of a neighbor do you want? So what do? While they're inside, first of all, it looks like a college campus. It literally looks like college dorms. Like I was in a college dorm that looks like Arlene. They have beach volleyball courts and pottery. I'm not making this up. I have photos I can show you, okay? And someone said, oh, I can hear this, the attack ads now. If the government did this, you're gonna stop on crime. My point is, try it and see, and don't shy about it. Be like, yeah, here's option A. Can I read this from the book for 1 second? This is like a paragraph, okay? This is gonna be the last thing I read, and then I'll wrap up with a brief word on Indigenous justice, okay? So this is the compare contrast between what people in Halden describe. This is the first paragraph, and the second paragraph is what people told us. It's not secondhand, this is what people told us they experienced in Canadian prisons and jails. Gardening, strumming a guitar, going to a yoga class, playing volleyball, making ceramics, baking a birthday cake, having a visit from distant family, learning how to fix a car, journaling, going along a stroll along the silver birch and placid pine trees. Eyes on fire from pepper spray, bruised wrists from handcuffs put on too tight, vomiting from withdrawal, being stabbed, being mocked and ridiculed by guards while naked in an open shower, drinking methadone someone else had vomited up to get a buzz, witnessing someone being beaten into a bloody pulp. Which of those two places is going to leave someone a better neighbor when they are released into your community, right? The data speaks for itself. It's obvious just hearing that. In Norway, their reoffending went from 60 to 70% reoffending, which is very similar to most of Canada, down to just 20%. People leave there having had trauma counseling, substance use treatment and recovery support, vocational training, and they're connected with communities. The guards in Canada, corrections officers in Canada, only have to have a high school diploma and CPR course, and they go do a bit and learn how to use force. They need a post-secondary degree, and they're trained extensively in mentorship and support in Norwegian prisons. So yeah, pottery classes, but it'll make us all safer. The final thing I wanted to mention, and then we'll have some time for some discussion questions from everyone, is Indigenous justice. Indigenous justice is absolutely one of the most significant things we have to do to move forward. Some of you are familiar with the statistics right now on the disproportionate rates of Indigenous incarceration. We did some further digging, and I've got some numbers from Manitoba. Some of you may know these, some of you may be shocked to hear some of this stuff. Within the federal system in Canada, 32% of federally incarcerated people are Indigenous, where it's just 5% or so of the national population. When we break it down a little further, our research team is good. They dig and they dig. They get a bone and they keep going after it. So we just kept going. It turns out 50%, half of all female federal incarcerated people in Canada are Indigenous women. Half. When we look here in Saskatchewan, is the problem going to get better or worse? One of the key metrics is new people coming in. So new admissions, okay? So you can't say, oh, it's just a problem from the past and we fixed it, right? What's coming in the door this year, the study that we have here, this is from 2019, 2020. Here in Manitoba, 76% of all new admissions into custody are Indigenous people, 76%. I can convincingly tell you that is going to get worse, and it's not a prediction, it is a certainty unless there's major policy change in this area. How can I say that with a certainty? Remember I mentioned about Courtney? She was 12 when she started going through the system. This is the pipeline. So what's the pipeline? Let's look at that. We know that the adult rate is 76% entry. It's 83% Indigenous teenagers being admitted into custody in the province. Can you believe there's even one more? The numbers this is the worst one, okay? In 2019, 2020, when I did the data for the book, on this part of the book at least, and we looked at that discrepancy between male and female, remember at the federal level, it was 32% of everyone were Indigenous and 50% for females. It turns out in both Manitoba and Saskatchewan, in 2019 and 2020, every single teenager admitted to custody who was a female was Indigenous. Every single one, 100%. So it is no wonder that this is described correctly as an ongoing colonial violence and a genocide against Indigenous people. There's no other way. You look at any other country and take the name Canada off and say that there's an Indigenous population or a racial minority, whatever, and you have those numbers, you're going to say there is something horrifically wrong going on. And so we need to turn the page. There should not be a single new jail or prison created in this country. There are multiple provinces and territories talking about creating new ones. We need to have a moratorium, number one, on any new places of incarceration being created. If you're having more people coming in the door, you've got to make a place like Halden. Try it once, just do one and see what happens. Okay? We know that Indigenous justice works and it gets better results. Indigenous peoples who I interviewed for the book, who are leading the way, have shown that it works and gets better results. So Indigenous-led peacekeeping and policing shows 25% reduction in violent crime, 25% reduction, and higher levels of satisfaction from community members, but it's chronically underfunded. And First Nations governments had to take the federal government to court repeatedly just to get their funding back up to the level that it should be. Likewise with Indigenous-led corrections. So Indigenous healing lodges, of which there are very few, are given substantially less per capita in funding. So whenever we see Indigenous nations stepping up to have their own justice systems be revitalized, they're getting stifled and stymied. So this is a big part of how we need to do things differently. So I'm going to end there, but I just wanted to leave you on that note that, you know, this is a real historic moment here in Manitoba. And I was absolutely thrilled to come here today at an opportunity to meet with Minister Weeb, who's your new Justice Minister. And he's got a copy of the book and he's already read like half of it. So, you know, catch up, okay? Just kidding. And I signed a copy for your premier. And I believe he's gonna read it. There's some premiers that I would give it to him. Well, this is gonna sit in the bathroom and maybe be used for something it shouldn't be used for. There's premiers who would do that, for sure. They wouldn't even bother. Well, they aren't. They're not bothering. They're not interested. So how do we get this change? We don't just wait for government. We need to, you know, if you support these policies, any of these ideas, get on the phone tomorrow morning or tonight with your MLA. Start showing up. Join up with one of these organizations that's in your community, because we are going to continue on a really bad path in our country if we don't. And I'm hoping that if in Manitoba, you take the steps of implementing some of these things, we're going to be able to point to say, hey, look what's happened in Manitoba. Look at the direction. Look at those numbers. Those numbers cannot get much worse, okay? They took a different path, a path of compassion, to break with the past. And look what happened when we have care and understanding in our communities. We have softer hearts. We show that we can change our minds. So I encourage you all, I'm leaving tomorrow morning, like 5 a.m. You're all staying here. Yeah. And so I look forward to seeing what you do, and consider me always on hand to support and encourage you on. And thank you for coming tonight. Appreciate it.
So we do have some time for questions. If anyone here has one, please feel free to just lift up your hand and I'll come over to you with the microphone. Yes.
I'm not sure how to ask this question. I've been working in the field of harm reduction for many, many years, and I'm confounded by the fact that people don't really get that or whatever. So you were in the belly of the beast as part of the Harper government or administration, or however that's described, and you've managed to, you know, move from that and move away from that. But what were you like before? Like what? You know, like what is that mentality when there's so much evidence to indicate that what we're doing is clearly wrong and not working, and actually doing the opposite of what they I think, are trying to achieve, which is to reduce crime and bloody blah. What's going on in those in there? Because I'm glad you're here, because I would never talk to Stephen Harper because he would piss me off too much. So what would be, like, can you describe that, and why is there, like, from your perspective, and maybe you can't answer this, like, why don't systems move and change when there's so much evidence pointing in the opposite direction?
Yeah, great question, thank you. So yeah, I gave some reflection on this actually recently, because someone else was asking a very similar question. And I think that what I concluded is that there are reasons that I supported, I'll say, tough on crime broadly, which includes not supporting harm reduction measures, that were I thought very altruistic. So I was like, what was it? Well, first of all, you're supporting the victims of crime, so that makes you a good guy. So you feel good about yourself, okay? The bad guys are the people who are hurting people and making us feel unsafe in our communities. And among the bad guys are people who use drugs. That's the logic. I'm not saying it's true. This is you're asking me to put myself back inside the cult. A cult, by the way, is defined as following a leader, and there's a system of beliefs, and that if you disagree with those, then you're excommunicated from the group. So there you go, okay? I don't know if all political parties are like that, but that is certainly like what it is. So the other thing with politics is that you enter with good reasons. Most people do, I think. They have certain things they care about, but then you sign on to this list of policies that you've never thought about. I'll give you an example. One of them was the federal conservatives were very supportive of the asbestos industry, because there's a town in Quebec, I don't know if you knew this, I didn't know until it became a political issue, called Asbestos Quebec. Did you know that? Yeah. Okay, so Asbestos Quebec happens to be in a certain electoral riding, which is a bit of a, like, we could win this if we support asbestos. Now, if you ask the average conservative voter if they support asbestos and the international export of it, this is where it went to, they would say, heck no, are you kidding me? But you plug your nose and turn the other way because, oh, that's so-and-so's riding. It's the same thing with seal hunt, shark fin soup. There's these issues that you're like, that's not my issue. Like, I might have an opinion, but most people it's not. So you end up subscribing to all these other things. So for me on the justice file, I was very concerned about victims being mistreated. I didn't think they were being treated fairly, and I still think that. But I didn't have any knowledge of, for example, like drug policy. So the party had a position. So ideology takes the place of thinking. If the party thinks for you, you don't have to think for yourself. So why would I read the studies? Because the party has already told me what to think. And I'm not going to go, it's not even my issue. If it was my issue, then I will work hard inside the party to change minds, and I've done that on other issues. So that's not to say I'm not responsible. So in this book, one of the things that you'll see is an apology. I apologize for the advice I gave and didn't give. And it is ignorance, and it is complicity, and I'm responsible for that, absolutely. But that's to give you a sense inside. Harm reduction was a word that was removed in terms of, that word itself was excised from any government, you're aware of that, others aren't, from any website news release. The reason I wrote my book Overdose the way I did is because it's directly responding to that in a way that I went through the change and saw. And so what changed my views, in addition to what I mentioned earlier, was actually talking to Leslie McBain with Mom Stop the Harm, who's one of the co-founders, talking to people who use substances. So being able to listen and hear. And unfortunately, not a lot of people are willing to do that.
And were there any other questions? Yes.
Thank you for putting all of those things into the book. I personally have worked in restorative justice for a number of years, and the criminal justice system always had an interest, mostly in diversion programs, so working with folks who had committed some sort of an offense, but then were not processed through the criminal justice system, but through community-based programs. And so it's really nice to hear somebody of your background and caliber putting all of those things together. I want to make a comment maybe to the current situation in Manitoba, and I'm partly very hopeful with the new government, but there's a couple of statements that have been made by the government, including tough on crime, particularly as it relates to drug trafficking. I don't know if that includes other elements as well. And I actually call me weird or not, I actually looked at the mandate letter that came from the Premier to the Justice Minister, and the mandate letter calls for a new prison or a new justice center in Dauphin, which is northwest of Winnipeg. So I'm always cautious with certain political ideologies being more focused on one thing than the other. And so my hope is that these things wouldn't just be tinkering with the system again, like it's been tried here. For example, under the previous Manitoba Conservative government, the number of incarcerated people actually dropped significantly over the years. But what they didn't do is they didn't use that funding that they saved to include other services that would be more conducive to the things that you were talking about. So the proof is in the pudding in the end, and I think the call would be I think unless somebody speaks up and reaches out to the minister, reaches out to an MLA, my fear is that even with a new government, some of those ideological tendencies would permeate that as well. So I think it's important to talk about that. The other comment that I want to make, and maybe you can respond to that, because there's a lot of money invested, there are certain professions that benefit from it as well, right?
Yeah.
Like you mentioned the guards, and there's sometimes powerful unions that are like interested in keeping the status quo as well. And I don't know if you have a response to that.
Mm-hmm.
And overall, sometimes the task is so large because it involves not just the criminal justice system, but you mentioned housing, right, which is federal, which is a provincial responsibility, and often these systems don't work very well together. You know, the education system, the child welfare system that we haven't really talked about yet, the child welfare to prison pipeline, those kinds of things, right? And sometimes it feels like there's so many things that would have to change, and I'm generally a pretty hopeful person, but sometimes it's hard to see that unless major change is happening and society demands something different than what we have been doing, unfortunately, my hope isn't very big that drastic changes are coming. So
yeah, thank you. That's a lot. I appreciate you sharing that. Just a couple of quick thoughts, I guess. We have an NDP government in BC, and they have gotten very much into the tough on crime stuff now. So they've retreated back on decriminalization. They've supported the bail reform measures. They have not been supportive of safer supply, and it's in full retreat mode for them, basically. Yeah, and it's also the Premier, Premier David Eby has a background working in the downtown east side. I mean, I was there a few days ago, people saying he needs to take that off his resume because it's a disgrace the way he's treating folks who are in that community right now. So, it can go the other way. So I think in terms of supporting policies, it's why it's an opportunity. It's not a foregone conclusion. You can have good people in office and they can have good intentions, but if the public's not on board and not supportive and vocally supporting them, then other people are saying this. So you've got the bureaucracy, which has been under an old administration for a long time, who have been kind of indoctrinated in that world and been doing policy work for another political party. Things are moving forward. So it's like a big ship to turn. So yeah, I agree with you. I think cautious optimism is how I would describe it. Cautious optimism, and looking for results and being there to encourage, support, and cheer and hold accountable. In terms of the scope of the change that's needed and having hope, yeah, I oscillate. My wife can tell you. I oscillate between being very discouraged often and then going, well, what's the part? And also on an individual level, what's the part? Is this making any difference? We left our kids at home. We're traveling all week doing this. Is this making any difference? And it's really easy to think no. But then I have people come up to me and say like, hey, I listened to that podcast. I'm like, did anyone listen? She's like, it says there are numbers on my screen who are, but I don't know. Yeah, and I want to go into law. I just graduated from law school. And I'm going to do things differently. Or I'm entering into this field. I had someone said I'm doing harm reduction work because I read that book. So I'm not saying my books are super duper. I'm just saying each of us has a way to influence people and support and change. And we don't need to wait for someone. We shouldn't wait for someone else to go and make the change. And certainly don't go waiting for government to change our society. We do it in ourselves first by listening, having compassion. Do we call the police on that person in the tent, or do we go bring them some warm food, right? How do we spend our time and resources? When do we pick up the phone and call? Don't just sit on our phone, on our computers, click, 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 like, dislike, retweet this. That's not doing much. I hate to tell you, I've had to tell myself that, okay? Not doing much. Pick up the phone, go to a meeting, go to a rally. You know, these things make an impact. So yeah, we have another question over here, or a comment. Yeah.
So we have one more question, and we are just at the top of the hour. So after this, we'll have some closing comments from Ben, and then we'll move on to the side.
I don't know how to really phrase this question, but do you think maybe instead of having also just crisis workers like cops should maybe undergo training to de-escalate the situation with words instead of force?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think de-escalation training is really important, but if it's still someone who doesn't have these other tools, I'm worried it doesn't do a lot. So we've seen that with, for example, like training them around how they interact with someone with autism. You know, we've had cases where the police have mistaken someone with autism as being intoxicated or something. And so New York State and other states have had like mandatory autism training, for example. And they found that it doesn't make much of a difference as they hoped it would. So I do think it's important, but I would say that probably still, and I think we should do it, but I think it still falls within the tinkering thing. Another example that would be in Montreal, there's a really vocal Black police officer who said, I engaged in racial profiling. He's like, I did it, and I'm Black, and I racially profiled Black people. He's like, I was a police officer before I wasn't a Black police officer, I was a police officer who was Black. And so that's part of the issue. I've also spoken to like Indigenous police officers in settler police forces, and they have said, you know, this is the system we're in. And so it really limits it. So I don't want to discourage people from participating and being part of the system in that, but just being aware that the system can end up changing us, and rather than us changing it. But yeah, thank you for your question.
So I wasn't sure if you have any closing comments you might like to offer.
Yeah, I just really encourage people to check out the podcast. If you listen to podcasts, for sure, and if you don't, maybe make it your first one, because again, the whole point of this book was to really respond to what the late Harold Johnson said, and maybe it would be good to end with what he said. When I read his book before he passed away, and we had him come and speak to our entire first year law class, he said, "You're never going to solve these problems by having conversations about us without us. You're never going to have these." And that goes for people who use substances, that goes for people who are experiencing homelessness, that goes for Indigenous people. And that's what you're going to hear in the podcast. That's what you're going to read in the book. People who are not usually or ever at the table, whose voices are not heard. So we need to listen to them and be willing to do things differently. So thank you for coming out tonight, and I look forward to chatting with some of you afterwards. Oh, it's the same as the book. Great, critical question. What's the name of your podcast? Great question. Thank you for that question. It's the exact same as the book. So if you go on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, yeah, do it now. I love the phones are out. This is great. Yeah, and it's called Indictment: The Criminal Justice System on Trial. And it's an add-on to the book. It's like the bonus content, okay, if you will. So I look forward to meeting some of you. Please connect with me on social media, reach out. If you're part of a community-based organization and you want to talk more about this or do like a webinar or something, sign me up, do it for free. We love talking about these ideas, and you can pick one and run with it, or a bigger picture thing. But it means a lot that you all came out tonight. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you, of course, to Antoinette and Arlene from Don't Stop the Harm for sharing with us tonight. We will now move along to the signing portion of the evening. So please feel free to join us over at the signing table. It's just beside the cash desk. We have copies of Indictment there. We have copies of Indictment at the cash desk. Please do feel free to get a copy signed before you pay for it. Just please pay for the book. We're enormously grateful to the University. Exactly. We're enormously grateful to the University of Toronto Press for publishing this book and for making this evening happen. Thank you all for your attention and for your questions, and have a lovely evening.